Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist, anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Saligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. This week I had the opportunity to sit down with Margaret Killjoy to talk about her new EP called Every Breath Our Last, out this October from her one-woman project Nomadic War Machine. Margaret is a writer, musician, and anarchist based in Western North Carolina and is someone who has made periodic appearances on The Final Straw and other anarchist news and culture sources. We got to talk about a lot of things in this episode, including her new EP, what went into making it, Nomadic War Machine as a project in general, and her new anarchist fiction podcast called We Will Remember Freedom. This was a great conversation to have for me and is a little bit of a different approach than what we usually do, in that the conversation unfolded organically with little in the way of preset prompts. I hope that you will get a sense of sitting down at a kitchen table with two people who have known each other for some while, talking about stuff they would kind of normally talk about anyway, except it's being recorded. Before the interview, though, here is an announcement on behalf of Project Fang, and this quote is from their fundraising page. Quote, "Help Project Fang expand its critical support for imprisoned activists. The climate crisis and ongoing destruction of landscapes and wildlife are provoking a deepening sense of urgency in an increasing number of people. It can be a serious struggle to care for a world that is being plundered for profit, but there are more and more people turning their grief into resistance in defense of nature and other animals. From water protectors to pipeline protesters and wildlife and caged animal defenders, good people who care for our world are standing up for all of us. Unfortunately, taking such a stand can result in arrest, court, jail, and prison time." In 2016, Project Fang was established by the NYC-ABC as a much-needed attempt to fill a gap in the ongoing support work for the growing number of eco and animal rights prisoners in the United States. The focus of Project Fang funding is to help pay for prison visitation costs for friends and family of these prisoners. Visits from friends and family and loved ones are repeatedly identified by prisoners as one of the most important lifelines that exist for them. Without visits, the crushing isolation of life inside a prison becomes unbearable. However, visits can often be prohibitively expensive. Travel costs might include not only an expensive plane ticket, but also lodging, a rental car, and meals. These quickly add up to hundreds of dollars." End quote. If you would like to learn more about this fundraiser and more about Project Fang, you can visit our show notes where we will post a link to their page and more information about them. And now, here are some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a ball!
Getting toward the end of the year when a lot of things are happening in rapid succession, including holidays and other events. But one of the most obvious things to happen at the end of the year is that the calendar abruptly stops. It's been my experience, maybe coincidentally, but my calendar always ends on the same day of the year. Go figure. Fortunately for me, I was called over to property the other day to pick up a free calendar that was mailed to me, thanks to Scott Crow, who picked up the tab. I got a Certain Days 2020 Freedom for Political Prisoners calendar. It's put out by the Certain Days in Montreal, Canada. But no worries. As far as I can tell, the Canadian year matches day for day. They start in January and they end in December, just like we do. Prisoners David Gilbert and, I'm probably going to butcher this, Janakli, whose given name was Alvaro Luna Hernandez, are also involved in putting this out. David Gilbert was formerly with the Weather Underground and has written two really good books that I recommend, No Surrender and Love and Struggle. Janakli has been held in solitary for 19 years in Texas, where he challenges the illegitimate occupation of land that the U.S. stole from Mexico. All of the proceeds from certain days' calendar sales go to Adamir, a Palestinian prisoner support group, to release aging people in prison, and to a number of other campaigns and organizations that get a lot less recognition than they probably deserve. A lot of really talented prisoner artists and writers are featured in the 2020 calendar, including Stephen Wilson, John Lahman of the Ohio 7, and my personal friend Oso Blanco, who funded the Zapatistas through bank robberies, among others. June features both Eric King and Marius Mason. The theme for this year's calendar is knitting together the struggles, and Eric McBay wrote in part, "Just as we are not isolated in the world, neither are our movements. There is an energy that bonds us and pushes us towards supporting one another in various causes. I see a direct link between us, the Palestinian freedom movement, and radical feminism, between the anarchists and the BLA, between the prison abolitionists and the ELF/ALF. And to quote Marius Mason, "What is true is that I have traded my freedom and everything I held dear in the free world for a chance at building a new world by resisting the old. I made many, many mistakes and some terrible decisions in that passionate quest. I am humbled by this, but not embittered. Because if there is a dialogue, reflection, and analysis, then perhaps there can be some worthwhile lesson found in my experience that could benefit any resistance movement in its growth." Yeah, good stuff. And the artwork is fantastic. In my own personal experience, I had a 2013 Certain Days calendar when I was locked up in the Special Management Unit at Mansfield Correctional, subjected to a year of torture. My cellmate Blackjack and I had very little, experiencing sleep deprivation, starvation, and a whole regimen of state terrors. But we had a Certain Days calendar hanging in the middle of an otherwise empty cinder block wall. And whatever we were going through, we would look at the date and see listed there an event in liberation history, a prison riot or a prisoner's release, the birth of an important rebel, or some atrocity committed by our collective enemy, an atrocity we should never forget. We had artwork from other prisoners who had perhaps experienced everything we were enduring. It reminded us that there was a whole history, a long continuum of struggle and resistance that preceded us, a long continuum of struggle and resistance that would undoubtedly extend far into the future. And we both derived some strength from that, some resolve. So a Certain Days calendar doesn't just make ordinary time in an ordinary world. It also has the power to ground us and anchor us in times that crawl, when hours feel like days, and you swear that the clock must be going backward. Sadly, you won't find a contribution from me in this year's calendar. It's not their fault. They invited me and I wrote something, but Certain Days quickly learned what everyone but Burst has already figured out. You can't take me anywhere in public. I guess they're not necessarily opposed to blowing things up. They just can't print my article advocating that we blow up specific stuff. Everybody seems to have picky editorial policies about explosives. Go figure. You can order your Certain Days calendar at certaindays.org. They're $15 or $8 for prisoners. They fill up empty, ugly walls, and they change an otherwise empty and ugly world. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillon, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillon, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at SeanSwain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at SwainRocks.
So, for those of you who haven't heard your past interviews either here or on other platforms, would you just introduce yourself for listeners, name, pronouns, whatever else you like?
Sure. My name's Margaret Killjoy. I use she and her or they and them pronouns, and I'm probably most known for writing fiction, science fiction and fantasy, but I also have a lot of musical projects, mostly Nomadic War Machine, which is a dark electronic project, and Feminazgul, which is a black metal project.
Feminazgul.
Yeah.
Will you talk about the name of that project?
Sure. I knew I wanted to name a band Feminazgul for a while, ever since...
It's so good.
Since my friend one day just told me the joke, I'm not a feminazi, I'm a feminazgul. And that resonated with me quite a lot. Years ago, one of my friends was like, Margaret, is your gender wraith? Because especially at the time, and still a little bit, I tend to wear clothes that don't exactly accentuate my gender or body, but instead obliterate it. And I wear a lot of black flowy clothes and things. So I've always kind of identified it with wraiths. And then I knew I was going to do a project called Feminazgul at some point. And then at one point I had I came back from New Orleans, heartbroken from trying to date a straight girl. And I was like, okay, now is the time to do this project that leans into trans femininity or just femininity in general. And so I wrote a 3-track EP called The Age of Men is Over, which is another Tolkien reference. And it's actually been the most successful musical project I've ever done, at least in terms of its reach. A clever name will take you very far.
I like the gender nihilism inherent in what you just said, and also sort of the nerd intersections of what you just said too, because the cultural production of the construct of the wraith has a lot of really heavy Tolkien, really heavy I don't even know D&D or Magic the Gathering sort of strains or roots implanted into it just by how we think about it. So I like that a lot. Does it have anything else come up for you? Well,
it's funny because we kind of backwards tried to figure out what it means to be Feminazgul, and because the Nazgul are running around trying to take the Ring of Power, and the Nazgul are the enemy, and they're kings who are seeking after lost power and helping out an autocrat. But I like to imagine that the Feminazgul instead are people who are trying to steal power from men or from the sort of existing patriarchal structures. But yeah, no, I also just have always been really into really nerdy shit, and taking it seriously and earnestly has been really useful for me.
That's fantastic. That makes me kind of think about this zine that came out 10 years ago maybe, called Orc, where the author was, it's been so long, but making an argument for the liberatory or revolutionary potential in sort of the character of the orc. There was this one scene where the author wrote about, and this is cut out of all of the other canon, because the orcs are supposed to, in this weird Victorian structure that Tolkien has created or was entrenched in his life, there's very absolute good and absolute evil, and orcs are obviously absolute evil. But there's this one tiny passage, and I think the third book, where they're it was way better once the bosses weren't here, right? We could just do whatever the fuck we wanted to do, and nobody was stepping on us. So I think that that's an interesting sort of undercurrent that gets a little bit ignored, except by anarchists.
Yeah, I loved that zine, and it was actually really deeply influential on me to think about monstrosity and how monstrosity relates to us as would-be revolutionists, and also how monstrosity relates to us as trans people or queer people or the other ways in which we're marginalized by society. Yeah, I don't know. I think I've been leaning more and more into it, which is interesting because I don't totally love when we identify as villains. I think that there's something kind of dangerous to this idea that because we're against existing society, we venerate villains. It makes sense because, say for example, for myself as someone who only in the past maybe 3 years have come out as a trans woman, I've always been a very feminine man and wearing makeup. And if you have dark makeup and dark facial hair. I've literally had children call me a villain in public multiple times in my life, where like they've looked at their parents and been like, "Mommy, there's a villain in the store." And that's heavily because of femme coding. That's heavily because of this idea that a feminized man is a villain. And I embrace that a little bit because we always have to kind of romanticize our oppressions, because otherwise the hell else are we going to do? But I like mostly kind of don't want to give them that space. I like mostly don't want to only identify with the villains. But there's something about monstrosity that I feel like kind of transcends that, because then it's not just this like Disney concept of good and evil. There's something more visceral and like embracing the ways in which we are like disgusting that allows us to find power, or at least has allowed me a lot to find power.
Yeah, I like that too. And that was like a really heavily like influential driver in that zine org. We here are two trans people talking about, yeah, and I know that like I've had conversations with you off the mic a lot about the idea of monstrosity and embracing sort of the like vileness that society puts onto trans people. But and I feel like we could talk about that for a long time, but would you talk about your new musical project, any like influences you had about this current one, and any hopes that you have for it?
Sure. I just released an EP with my project Nomadic War Machine, and the EP is called Every Breath Our Last, and it's an attempt to kind of write something that's a little bit more accessible than most of what I've done with that project. Most of that project started off as like sort of gothic breakcore in 2010, and then in 2018 I released an album that was dance music but heavily like kind of drone influenced and with no vocals. And now I'm trying to work with something that's a little bit more intentionally pop. It's still dark, it's still probably closer to industrial than it is to pop music. And I've been doing that mostly just to kind of like, there's not like a grand political purpose behind that. In some ways it's just like, I think my maturation as a songwriter, and an interesting test, an interesting experiment to see if I can write the kind of dark pop stuff that I love, but still kind of maintain this noisier element or something that's like within the music a little bit harsher or something.
Nomadic War Machine has been around for a while now, and I remember having a conversation with you maybe a year ago after one of your shows, because like a huge part of a Nomadic War Machine set is visual, which like you can't really replicate the like feeling of that, seeing the music and seeing the sort of like visual presentation that you edit. And I remember having, you were like, yeah, it's kind of, and I was just like, yeah, and I feel like a little bit spellbound every single time. And you were like, that's exactly what I'm going for. Yeah. I remember that the like language that you used was sort of like casting a spell somehow on the audience. Is that still like something you're going for? Is that like something that has evolved into something else? Yeah, totally. It's funny because I do believe in magic, not quite in the same way that a lot of practitioners I know do. And for me, I try to work that magic through my art, and I try to do it in ways that are sort of consensual and liberatory, which is an interesting challenge. So if you come to my show, I want you to enter a certain headspace. And a lot of my influence around that, I mean, some of the first times I watched like experimental film, I was like, I don't get it, I'm kind of bored. But then the way that my brain would drift away, I actually realized I enjoyed that. I liked my own thought processes while engaging with this media. And ever since then, I think I've been trying to learn how to put people into headspaces where they can kind of think about things without thinking about things, a space where people can have an aesthetic experience. I would say I use aesthetics as magic or whatever. And the first time I realized I was doing it, I remember one of the first shows I played was in a basement in Baltimore, and I was just me with a keytar and no vocals, and there's just riot porn playing on the screen behind me, and it's just people fighting cops for 20 minutes interspersed with other things to try and break it up and give it some dynamics. But it's essentially this like glorification of
conflict with the state that hopefully attempts to address the fact that it's glorification, and so that I never want to trick anyone into believing the same thing as me. But I remember this drunk college hipster came up to me after the show and just went on about how he had been doing everything wrong with his life, and college isn't what mattered, and he needed to like completely rethink his life. And I was like, oh, that's what I'm trying to do. And I don't know whether he woke up in the morning and like, started organizing or started, joining in on riots, or I don't know what he did. But I've realized that my own participation in culture as an anarchist, culture has always like reinforced my anarchist practice. Like leaving the demo and then going to a show played by people who were participants in that demonstration is powerful. And it can keep you going through a lot. And so I try to figure out ways to participate in that. And how the spell has kind of changed now, it's like interesting because, yeah, my music is slightly less droney. It's slightly less built around a certain atmosphere. And I'm still kind of teasing out what it can be, but I think it'll end up stronger. I mean, I remember one of my first bands in college, my bandmate was like, until there's vocals, it's not a song, it's a track.
Interesting.
And he was really condescending, but I still think about that. And I think that there's something that we do resonate with about hearing the human voice. And so I think that I'm learning how to use that as well.
Yeah, that's... At the same time, too, we also live in such a heavily image-focused culture, and I think that our brains either really enjoy to see ourselves reflected in the things that we do and like the things that we see. So yeah, I think there's the human voice, and that's interesting. I'd never really thought about it that way. And cultural production is an interesting topic as well. Like before the interview started rolling, we were talking about what to talk about, and cultural reproduction or production as anarchists kind of came up. And I would love to hear you speak about your podcast, We Will Remember Freedom, which is a fiction podcast that you have just started running, and like any thoughts that you have on that.
Sure. Yeah, we just put up I mean, I'm not the only person engaged with the project, actually, so I think I can say we. We just put up the 4th episode yesterday, and it's a project that I've been kind of tossing around for a long time. One of the main spaces I engage in is fiction, both as an editor and as a reader and a writer. And I think fiction is a really interesting component in culture because it's one of the only ones that you can engage with alone. I mean, you can listen to music alone, but most bands are not only one person, whereas most writers are, and you can also just sit around and read, and you can read fiction and still be participating in anarchist culture if you're like less social and don't want to go to shows all the time or whatever the cultural events that are happening are. And as someone who, I'm not wildly social, so that's always been a useful outlet for me. Growing up, I also think that fiction is a really good vehicle because it's good at asking questions instead of offering answers. So I think it's actually specifically situated for anarchists over other political ideologies because other political ideologies, probably not all of them, but most of them tend to offer answers, whereas I think anarchism has some suggestions, but is mostly about trying to ask people to think through their own problems, develop their own sense of agency, and take responsibility for their own lives. Yeah. And fiction doesn't work nearly as well when it's like super pedantic and super just like, here's the problem to society, And I think it's telling that most of the anarchist utopias are actually fairly critical of anarchism, including the ones written by anarchists, because I don't think we're trying to paint the like shining city on the hill in the same way that maybe state communists are or something like that. Yeah. Oh, and so the podcast, I started editing fiction. When I say editing, I don't edit the work, but people send me their stories. I choose which ones, and then I have voice actors read them. So it's a podcast where you'll listen to a story and then I'll interview the writer, and it's all stories that are either by anarchists, about anarchists, or sort of interest to anarchists. And I also expand anarchists very explicitly in the call for submissions to anyone, whether they identify as an anarchist or with a different political ideology that is anti-authoritarian and anti-capitalist, because I don't want to exclude people who are part of different indigenous traditions or, just like other ways of understanding the same thing.
Yeah, and I like that too. That's something that, as like somebody who's like been doing this media project for, I don't even fucking know, like maybe 6 or 7 years at this point, I'm not somebody who like really gravitated towards media, but through certain like life circumstances sort of like fell into the project.
Mm-hmm.
How to like not be prescriptive. And also, and one thing that I've been struggling with at various points in the final straw has been how to not just like hit somebody over the head repeatedly with something that like might be pretty upsetting. Like there's a lot of really upsetting things going on in the world.
Yeah.
All the time, especially if you're interfacing with like systems who sort of pivot upon the like social death and isolation of human beings, like prisons or like systemic racism or ongoing colonization or ongoing genocides. How to like make not traumatic or accessible the sort of like struggles or situations that you want to highlight.
Yeah.
And it's hard because we have such a rapid turnaround how to like be creative in that or whatever, or even if it's like acceptable to do that. Creativity is a funny sort of concept when you're a media project. And I think people do it really well, and like there's been a lot of like non-anarchist, like the media projects I can think of are not anarchist who do this really well, like creative journalism, for example, which takes a shit ton of resources all the time.
But I think that final straw, like, I mean, when you're talking about, for example, the struggle to not be prescriptive, I actually think you all do a good job of that, because by having kind of more of a talk radio format, it's a little less like, hello and welcome to The Answers.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I would actually love to listen to a podcast by William Goodenough that was like called The Answers, in which you just explained the answers to everything. Whether you did it completely earnestly or tongue-in-cheek, either way, it would probably be good and creative. But yeah, I don't know. It is also a constant thing. I mean, I think that's like one of the reasons people call science fiction fantasy escapism, and that's always been used to put them down historically. And I think it's Tolkien, who of course is intensely complicated, problematic in so many ways, while also being, I would argue that Tolkien's probably one of the most influential unconscious racists of the 20th century, which, and I'm not affected by racial oppression, so it's easy for me to be like, that's not as bad as being consciously racist, but I don't know, I don't experience that. But I think the themes that he plays with, like destroying power and all of that, are really interesting and good. And I also think that near the end of his life, his critique of power like brought him actually even more explicitly in conversation with anarchism. Like he has this quote about, as I get older, I find myself more and more of an anarchist. And he...
I would love to know what that meant to him.
Yeah, well, so it's really complicated because the whole quote, I'm going to paraphrase it and destroy it, but it's like, as I become older, I become more and more of an anarchist, meaning self-governance, not bearded men with bombs or something like that, or a monarchist. But basically he goes on to say that the worst job for any man is to rule other men, and not one in a million is fit for it, least of all those who wish to do it. And it was in a letter he wrote to his son. And I think it's really telling that the point of the Lord of the Rings, the parable of it is destroy power. Do not wield power, destroy it. And while it ignores the sort of like pocket monarchies and nationalisms of, the Rohirrim and Gondor, and of course the elves, which seem to be a fairly autocratic society also, it ignores the sort of individual hierarchies within those, but it certainly believes that there can't be one autocrat to rule them all. And that concept needs to be destroyed. And basically, like, the weak-willed liberals are the ones who are like, no, we will wield the ring of power. So I
AKA voting.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Like, you know, you can't use the state to destroy the state, I feel like is like kind of what Tolkien's trying to get at. And I don't remember why I got on about that, but...
Well, it's funny that he would, like, draw his own lines between anarchism and monarchism. I mean, in that way, like, oh yeah, motherfucker, you're looking for the one true king, of course. Or if it's not one true king, it's like total and utter chaos in the classical sense of the word.
I think he actually meant anarchism as relates to, like, our ideology, because I know he, by at least referencing bearded men with bombs, is like the negative incarnation of it, which of course there's many bearded men bombs with history who've done wonderful things in the name of anarchism, and other ones who've done horrible things in the name of anarchism. But that's the impression I get. But I'm not a really intense Tolkien scholar or anything like that. It's just like it's a myth that matters to me.
It's a myth that's really shaped the way we think about, like, or at least, like, Western or, like, Anglophone acculturated people, has shaped, like, our value systems and shaped how we think about nature or how we think about people. And a lot of that stuff needs to be, like so many of the things that we have need to be destroyed, in my opinion. But it's interesting to like sort of point to where all that stuff came from for a lot of people. Now, like, I know that Tolkien was super, you know, influential in England, obviously, but also in places that England colonized, like India and a bunch of other places around the world. And so it is interesting to see, like, the lines that exist for folks from those areas.
Well, and that gets at one of the reasons to be cultural producers, is that the myths and the stories we tell, like, kind of shape what we view as possible or desirable. Like, I think we tend to create who we are or who we want to be based on these idealized selves, which are often characters out of fiction or religion. But I mean, religion and mythology seem very related to me. And that, of course, is like, has been very limited by the systemic racism in publishing, by the systemic exclusion of women's voices. You know, by saying which voices are allowed to be heard, of course, we're changing what stories the next generations have. I have this whole concept in my head about kind of like the mess that we're in at the moment being essentially like us winning on the cultural front in this like grander war. And when I say us, I don't necessarily mean anarchists, but I mean people who like lean towards freedom, who like lean towards not being bigots, you know, like lean towards sharing the general leftist / anti-authoritarian tendencies within culture, I think have like really started to come into being in terms of the media that's even like the mainstream media that's available in terms of stories. And I think that the right wing has reacted the best way they know how, which is to fight badly from a cultural point of view, but well from a political point of view. You know, because like overall, these are the people who are absolutely a smallish portion of society of like rich, white, cis men. But the one thing that they have access to is power and political power. And so I think as we're winning cultural power, it's in part spurring on a political backlash. Thinking about like how much anti-trans stuff is happening right now. And I think that is largely because, well, there's so many more of us who are out right now because of the fact that it's safer now, which of course turns into an irony because now it's a little bit less safe. It certainly feels to me than it did 3 years ago when it came out. But, and I don't see any way around that. I mean, there's no Dan Harmon, who's a very complicated figure in the cultural front, the person who does Rick and Morty, has this great anti-Nazi rant where he's just like, look, it's like, you have Nazis, you have cancer. One of two things is going to happen. They die or you die. Like, it's going to suck. You're fighting cancer. You're fighting Nazis. There's no nice way around it. And so when I think about, like, yeah, by pushing the trans agenda or whatever, you know, we are spurring on the right wing to take action. But, like, the only other choice is inaction. And so I'm perfectly willing to take action, even if it brings reaction.
This is the Final Straw Radio Show, and I'm your host, William. We are airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina. We are listening to an interview that I did a few weeks ago with Margaret Killjoy, who is an anarchist and a musician, talking about her work and her latest musical release. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you talk about that trend, like all of the anti-trans, like hella right-wing sort of like resurgence style activities that are going on, and also thinking about like how things changed over the years, specifically regarding like how anarchist politics isn't really as like far out of the mainstream as it used to be. Mm-hmm. And also has confusingly, like, aspects of it have been sort of like adopted in some sort of weird way by people who are our enemies.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Like, you and I are basically the same age.
Yeah.
Of the same age. And I definitely think as well, from my own experience, I see even words like accountability, mm-hmm. which, like, you would never see somebody use that word who was, like, outside of the anarchist milieu, and now you sort of see it happening all the time, and now we kind of don't even use that word anymore because of how it's been polluted or whatever, but, yeah, it's just, like, really interesting to think about how polarization happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the first time I ever ran across the concept of verbal consent was a forest defense camp on the West Coast run by anarchists in 2003, 4. And I remember even in anarchist circles as sort of a joke, people were like, oh, if you go out to the West Coast, you have to ask before you kiss someone.
Oh.
And then I watched it spread through anarchism, and I'm sure there were other circles that were doing comparable things, but, like, absolutely the first places I saw were anarchist circles, and where I saw those discussions happen about what that means and what the nuances of that are. And then it eventually becomes mainstream. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked that it became mainstream. And yeah, one of the things that's, like, been really bizarre to watch is so many of my values have become mainstream. Mm-hmm. The idea that we can identify gender-wise however we want, the idea that a non-binary pronoun is a desirable thing that can be respected, and is, like, wild to me that has become mainstream. And I think overall that's really good. I mean, obviously when we get these, like, kind of cultural gains, mm-hmm. sometimes it becomes harder to push further because people are a little bit more complacent with what they have. But that's just always going to happen. And it's not the same as, like, political reform. It's not the same as, like, asking the state to grant us concessions. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but Malatesta has this quote about reform I love. That's just like, we will take all reforms in the manner of an army gaining territory. Mm. And that's how I try to think about them, is like verbal consent. I hate thinking back of my life before verbal consent, you know? But we do have a tendency, I think, to sometimes as anarchists to be kind of political hipsters, where as soon as something's, like, mainstream, we're like, oh, we don't like it anymore, you know?
Oh, it's so fucking funny. It's so true.
And like, sometimes we're, like, right, you know, but sometimes we're just not. And, like, I can never tell, like, you know, I mean, like, it was mostly around anarchists and stuff that I ran across, like, people, like, caring about consumer politics for a long time. And then anarchists were also the leading edge of the to hell with consumer politics. You know, let's shop where we can afford to eat and not shame people for shopping where they can afford to eat. I don't know, it gets messy.
It does get messy. And am I, like, happy that it is easier for, like, young trans kids to come out? Absolutely. I'm happier. Do I trust, like, systems that are in power? And not only just, like, because the systems of power that we have live in every single one of us, and is something that needs to be battled every single day, every single available moment that you have. Am I happy that, like, it's cool to be trans because Caitlyn Jenner? No.
Yeah.
Like she's still a rich white woman who is rich white womaning everywhere that she goes. So uncritically, and it's like cool because she's trans or whatever. But I'm like,
yeah. We have a gay cop in Asheville now.
We have a gay cop in Asheville. Hallelujah.
Yeah. See, I'm avoiding cussing because I'm not the one who has to do the editing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm just making my own life harder.
For anyone listening, I don't normally say "to hell with." That is not my usual.
That's amazing. Yeah, and that, like, also because I'm thinking about earlier in the interview we were talking about sort of cultural reproduction and art, and thinking about all of the stuff that's going on in the world right now. And for any listeners, we're recording this kind of at the end of October. There are, uprisings happening in Chile, Honduras, Lebanon, to beyond, to like conflicts in northeast Syria that are, spurred on by literal fascism. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about, like, creating meaningful culture or creating meaningful art, like, while sort of all of this is happening. And I think that's going to be, for me, like, that's going to be really important sort of like moving forward, because I can only see this trend escalating.
Yeah. It's hard because, I mean, I get really annoyed by artists being very self-important about the importance of culture and the importance of art. And, like, I do trace this, like, narrative of cultural change being the forefront of change, but it's not what matters. Materially getting free is far more important. And if culture can help that, that's great. But it's like legal support. Like, legal support is wonderful and often overlooked. But the point of legal support is to support the people who are taking direct action, or who didn't even take direct action but just got screwed by, let's go with circumstance, but really just, racist systems or whatever. And now singing the praises of legal support is completely necessary because it's not done enough. People who do grunt support work are not held up as, like, the heroes that they are or whatever, whereas artists and writers tend to be. And that's a problem. And it's hard to interface with that while the world is, like, falling apart, or falling apart. It's always falling apart, but while this current thing is happening, because I still do believe that writing matters, and that art matters, and that podcasts matter, and that cultural creation matters. But it's, like, probably not as important as direct confrontation with the systems that need to be directly confronted. And it's really hard because the other thing about being a cultural creator for me, and I'm wondering whether you would, being a similar age as me, have a similar experience, is that at a certain point, it feels necessary to be out of harm's way slightly more than you used to be. I used to be in harm's way very consciously and intentionally, kind of all the time. And now I, like, look for little pockets of safety. And so in some ways I create art because it's the way that I can feel like I'm still engaged while being, like, slightly less constantly traumatized by, direct conflict with the state. So it's funny because I'm just starting to get the hang of, like, how to be useful and also how to, like, just live my life. I'm, like, just starting to, after however many years, I finally am, like, bringing in enough money through my writing that I'm, like, starting to get laser hair removal on my face, I'm, like, just starting to, like, get things figured out, and then it's all falling apart. And
that's so real.
And I don't want it to fall apart. When I was 20, I wanted it to fall apart because, well, just seeing how, and I don't think I was wrong at 20. I'm not saying, oh, I was an idiot then and I'm wise now. I don't know. I'm not wiser now or then. It's just a different way of interacting with the world. Like, I've managed to carve out small amounts of comfort, and I don't want to lose that. And this is actually really shy and embarrassing to admit in front of, who knows who. And so that's one of the main tensions for me. What does it mean? And hopefully attempting to have some kind of humility around it and try and like keep the attention focused on the people who are more actively doing the work, except of course also that a lot of those people don't want the attention. Like, there's a lot of things that I or anyone else might do that we just like literally don't want to be known for. So
yeah, and I think that craving a certain amount of safety or stability, and I mean in an increasingly like unsafe and unstable structure in which we live, not just the physical structures obviously, but psychological structures in which we live, is I think really real. My relationship to safety is a little bit different, just because I'm somebody who has always sort of been proximal to unsafeness, like more proximal, say, than like other of my peers, or by virtue of like chronic poverty, by virtue of like having been trans-identified from a like fairly young age, and also being somebody who's mixed race. Yeah. Also somebody who is also femme-coded. Yeah. And while like being somebody who identifies as a man as well, or who is a man, who is also femme-coded. And I think that knowing how to like rest and unwind is something that has been stolen from us by capitalism, and stolen from us by like various structures, because like capitalism wants us like unsure of ourselves, tired to the point of exhaustion all the time, and also like needing to work more because we're so broke, or whatever. But I got this really sort of impassioned, and this is like kind of off on a tangent, but I got this really impassioned like talk from a friend where they were like, you know that friendship is part of the work, right? And I was just like, that's a really important statement. Yeah. And that's a really important like thing to keep in mind. Like, friendship is part of the work, and like we can't do this without each other. Yeah. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but yeah, how to be useful is interesting. Like use is a really interesting construct. And I think it's so hard for me to disentangle the like construct of usefulness from like a puritanical sort of like capitalist framework that we all like have to fight with all the time. And I would like in sort of like a nihilist-ish cranky old nihilist kind of way, like for us to explore the concept of being unuseful. That makes sense. That's something I need to learn more about. You know, I've always had kind of a, when I was young, I thought I was really lazy. And I was like, I'm one of the laziest people I know. And it's actually just, I've always hated authority. And so whenever I had a job, I just didn't really like doing any of the work that I was asked to do. But as soon as I kind of discovered like working for myself or having my own goals and looking to accomplish them, I've had like struggles with workaholism, and it's been, well, like speaking of like, well, self-care isn't specifically what we're talking about, but like, you know, I had a mental health break that certainly the like fighting all the time in my late teens and early 20s influenced, but the thing that really caused it, I think, was my attempts to both be stable and work constantly on anarchist projects, you know? And my body and my brain like just revolted against me at some point. And ever since then, I've been like substantially less productive. Like sometimes I get really grouchy at myself about that. And so, yeah, this idea of maybe, how to not be useful is also important. And also because there's a certain amount of like, when you take up all the air in the room, there's none left for anyone else. And so like, you know, there's this kind of
this concept we have that there are certain people who make things, there's certain people whose ideas matter. Like, I've always been trying to figure out, I've been more and more into history, which is another good way to still feel like you're doing something without actually doing anything, is get really into anarchist history.
That's so cool.
And I mean, I could go on, I'm literally going to start an anarchist history podcast, and I'll have all kinds of reasons why it's useful. But at the end of the day, it's useful if it can keep us engaged here and now, and it's not useful otherwise. Mm-hmm. You know, like the only good armchair anarchist is the one who brought the armchair to the riots in California, you know? And, but I wonder how much the like historical anarchists, because all of the media from about us from then is not by us that we can mostly find. And so it's always like these followers of Kropotkin, or these Bakuninites, or, you know, these like Emma Goldman's followers did the following. Like, is that how they saw themselves? You know, did they see themselves as part of like, you know, another great example of how anarchism filters out to the mainstream is that the great man theory of history has like largely been disproven. You know, like history was not made by Alexander the Great. History was not made by Emma Goldman. Mm-hmm. You know, history was made by an incredible number of people. And I wonder whether they saw themselves that way, you know, and I don't know the answer to that. And maybe if I read more original sources, if I read more, you know, journals of actual anarchists from the time, I would have a better sense of whether they saw themselves as followers of this or that ideologue. Yeah. I'd like to imagine they didn't, but I don't know. And I don't want us to be that. Which brings into this awkward tension where, you know, I reached out to you. I was like, hey, can I be on your podcast? I have a new EP out. I want people to hear it, you know, and this constant work of self-promotion that I feel like I have to do as a creative professional or whatever in the modern era is like not my favorite thing politically or personally. But I also like when my work gets out there.
Definitely.
That was a tangent, just to bring it all back to me. That's the important thing.
Well, that's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, the great woman of history theory. Margaret Killjoy. Yeah.
I've been listening to a lot of that podcast Behind the Bastards recently.
Mm-hmm.
It's like hosted by this conflict journalist.
Yeah.
And the way he writes about sort of like the bad people of history and is like a historian in some way, but also like a studier of war and of conflict. And he pushes back against like this great man theory of history by being like, yeah, there was the great man. And I'm not going to remember the historical reference that he was making exactly, but he was like, and then there is one member of the like faceless army who shoots the general at a really specific magical time and ends the British Empire in that area. Yeah. You know? And like those are the times where like history pivots. Yeah. Right? It's not like with the people, you know, and it happens in all of these like complex ways because it's a complex current because like literally billions of people are participating in it. Yeah. And have participated in it all the time.
I wonder if that's like one reason why I'm so interested in anarchist history is because like I want to figure out how to make us protagonists. Like I want I one of the main things that I think I run across, like I remember talking to this liberal I care a lot about who was like, oh, well, we can't have the Green New Deal because Nancy Pelosi would never allow it. Yeah. And I'm not here to shill the Green New Deal, but like in a broad sense, we need to change the way our economy works so that we don't destroy the entire ecosystem on the globe. Yeah. Like that seems reasonably self-evident at this point, and is not a fringe belief. But here's someone who's intelligent, who's worked really hard her whole life, who's a liberal, who's like, well, we can't change the way our leaders will allow what can and can't happen. So they would literally lay down and die and let the entire world die before change the existing order. And I think that's about agency. I think that's about people not seeing themselves as agents of change, of seeing themselves as capable of like influencing their own lives and the lives of the world around them, or the lives of the world, whatever. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. When like death is the only thing you have as your tool, you know. Yeah. That's some stuff.
Yeah.
those are all the like weird prompts that I had scrawled on this piece of paper. I would love for you to plug how people can like follow you on social media and for like how people can listen to your new EP.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter at Magpie Killjoy. I'm on Facebook at Margaret Killjoy. There's only one L in Killjoy on Facebook because for some reason they don't believe it's a real name. Instagram, Margaret Killjoy. Most places, just Margaret Killjoy. I'm fairly public about everything I do. And my new EP is called Every Breath or Last, and it's on Spotify and Bandcamp and, you know, wherever you get your music, pretty much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Is there anything we missed that you want to touch on here? I'm sure there's so much more we could have talked about because, like, we're friends and stuff, but, like, yeah, is there anything that you want to give voice to here?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah,
it was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to our interview with Margaret Killjoy, who is a writer, a musician, an anarchist, and many, many more things. To help support Margaret in her endeavors and to read more of her writing, you can visit patreon.com/Margaret Killjoy, and that's KILLJOY. You can also visit our show notes where we will post additional links to further interviews by Margaret, including one that we did about a year ago on The Final Straw, and also one that was featured on the Soulcast, another anarchist podcast that includes her reading a short story called The Northern Host. To take us out, we are going to hear the first track on her new EP called We Feel No Shame.